The 2010s era of digital filmmaking was an interesting decade when it comes to the concept of cinematography. Some even call that time the golden era of filmmaking. But in that era cultivated an overlooked piece of equipment from the shadows that unknowingly at the time would alter the entire landscape of independent filmmaking as a whole. And this camera wasn't the sleekest camera in the world. It wasn't even the most expensive camera in the world. But the secret weapon that this camera had more than anything else was versatility. And this camera was a trailblazer that allowed aspiring filmmakers to capture cinematic quality on a budget, which sparked a wave of creativity that literally ripped through the film industry. And this game changer of a camera that I'm talking about is none other than the Canon 600D, also famously known as the Canon T3i. So this camera originally came out in 2011, back when DSLRs were a big thing. And while this camera was marketed more towards photographers, it had a lot of features at the time that were very, very key to a lot of filmmakers. The first of which being able to shoot 1080p at 24 frames per second, which seems like child's play by today's standards, but you'd be surprised at the amount of work back then and even today in 2025 that's still filmed in 1080p. But 80 to 90% of people will probably never notice this because they watch stuff from their phone anyway. And you're actually seeing B-roll of random sequences that I filmed with this camera, as well as the talking head that you're looking at right now being filmed with this camera. And while this isn't necessarily a question of whether the T3i is capable in 2025 of doing professional work, but it's more so of a call to action for people who have a passion for filmmaking to not let gear be your downfall in making your passion project or making your film. You know, all the footage that you see in this video has been upscaled to 4K, and you tell me how it looks. I'm not the most professional DP in the world or cinematographer in the world, but I like to practice shots, I like to practice composition, I like to try to get creative with natural lighting, seeing what type of exposure I can get without necessarily having to institute a bunch of expensive lighting. I could very easily have done this video mostly with the FX30 and then gave you guys B-roll of the T3i, but I more so enjoy the challenge of trying to work around a camera's limitations. And I did this more so to show people that you could take an older camera like the T3i, pair it with a 60s Soviet vintage lens like the Helios 442, and for $150 to $200, you could have a camera and lens system that could very well give you something that mimics cinema. And while many people have a very subjective overview of what cinematic actually means, it's ultimately more about being able to tell a story. And this is more of a video to let filmmakers know that while gear may matter in the sense of doing professional work, if you're wanting to do this full time, if you're wanting to do corporate shoots, weddings, things of that nature, it doesn't matter in a sense of being able to tell a story that invokes emotion and gets people wanting to see more of your content. You know, at the end of the day, as long as you have a camera that can shoot at least 1080p at 24 frames per second and the lens system is interchangeable to where you can put more expensive glass or more vintage glass on the camera system, you'll ultimately be able to produce an image that very much helps you stand out in the world of filmmaking, especially how saturated it is. You know, I love this camera in a sense that it takes me back to my roots as a filmmaker when I was young, just trying to get out there and film something. I didn't even know about frame rates yet back then when a camera like this came out. So being able to go back to a system like this years later, after accumulating the knowledge that I have about, you know, exposure triangle, composition, natural lighting, different angles and camera movements, things of that nature, it's just amazing the type of images that I can produce with a camera like this, even in 2025. Like I said, I wouldn't recommend you just buy this camera straight out to do professional work. But one of the reasons I bought the camera was to be able to practice a lot of my shots, a lot of my angles and things of that nature without necessarily having to risk my FX30, which is my A camera for a lot of my paid work. You know, if I'm doing some experimentation with a shot, I'd much rather risk this camera right here that you're looking at instead of the most expensive camera I own in my arsenal and then end up being up shit's creek without a paddle when it comes to trying to get paid work. So if you're someone who wants to dive into the realm of filmmaking and feels a little bit overwhelmed about the plethora of cameras that's out there and their prices and how expensive they are, and you've got 150 to 200 bucks just laying around that you want to sort of go into and try and see if filmmaking is a lane that you might want to get into, this is a camera you might want to look at as something to be like a knock-around camera or just to get some practice in. Like I said, you know, a couple caveats to this camera in 2025. You're not going to have any dual pixel autofocus. It wasn't in this model yet. Of course, you're locked to 1080p, 24 frames per second. You know, you're dealing with a slightly older codec, so the image is going to be a little bit softer. especially with the 18 megapixels that's in this camera. There's also really no video assist features like focus peaking, waveforms, histograms, zebras. So there's a software hack out there for a lot of these older Canons called Magic Lantern, where it doesn't replace Canon's original software, but just adds a firmware hack to the camera that gives you a lot of those assist features that I was talking about. And while with some of the later model cameras like the 650D, 700D, these cameras will actually allow you to film in RAW on the camera internally. The T3i's processing speed isn't necessarily fast enough to film in any type of internal RAW codec, but you are able to use this firmware hack on the T3i to use with the regular H.264 footage. But even when locked at 1080p 24 frames per second, this firmware hack unlocks the camera in a way that filmmakers would have never imagined back in 2011. And that's the thing, for a lot of people, this camera might just be sitting around in your parents' or grandparents' basement. Somebody may have gifted you this camera, and you'll have a lot of filmmakers tell you that this camera is useless in 2025. There's very much a lot of use cases for a camera like this. Let's say, for example, you need a crash cam for a car scene, and you don't want to risk one of your more expensive cameras to get that scene. $100 to $150, throw this camera in 1080p, 24 frames per second, set it on a car mount. You don't have to worry about breaking this camera. That's enough of me talking, guys. This was just a quick video I wanted to throw out there. I haven't been able to put much videos out there in a minute. I'm actually going to talk about that in another video I put out that's going to be pretty interesting as far as my opinion on the filmmaking industry as a whole in 2025 and where we've gotten, especially with the tribalism and how territorial filmmaking has become. But with that being said, man, don't be afraid to take an older camera like this and really produce some very, very unique and thought-provoking images and storytelling with a camera like this in 2025. It's been another one from your boy DaVinci HD, reminding you the only reason that piece of art that you want isn't out is because you haven't pressed record. See you guys on set. Peace out.